Sometimes the people we overlook the most are the ones who deserve our love the deepest. In the dusty frontier town, everyone had forgotten about Martha, a kind-hearted older woman dismissed by folks who should have known better. But one man saw her differently. A rugged mountain man who kept to himself, noticed what no one else could see, a soul worth protecting. When danger came to town, threatening everything Martha held dear, he made a choice that stunned everyone. He risked his land, his supplies, his very life to keep her safe. In the harsh world of the Old West, their bond grew into something nobody could ignore. What would make a man give up everything for a woman the world had cast aside? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Redemption Springs wasn't much to look at. In the summer of 1882, the town sat in a shallow valley where the mountains met the high desert, a collection of weathered buildings that had seen better days. The silver mine that once promised prosperity had played out 3 years back, leaving behind empty shafts and emptier pockets. Most folks who could leave had already gone. Those who remained did so because they had nowhere else to go, or because they were too stubborn to admit defeat. The main street ran a quarter-mile from the dried-up creek bed on the north end to the tiny cemetery on the south. In between stood the essentials of frontier life: a mercantile, a saloon, a livery stable, a bank that opened 3 days a week, and a sheriff's office that saw more sleeping than law enforcement. There was a church with a crooked steeple, a boarding house with peeling paint, and about 24 homes scattered like dice, thrown carelessly across the dusty earth. Martha Hendricks lived in that boarding house, and had for the past 12 years. She was 58 years old, though the hard years had etched themselves deeper into her face than mere numbers could account for. Her body carried the weight of time and grief, and too many meals skipped so others could eat. The townsfolk called her fat when they bothered to speak of her at all, though the word was less about her actual size and more about their need to diminish someone they'd already decided didn't matter. She'd been a bride once, young and hopeful, with a husband who worked the silver mine and promised her a house with glass windows and a garden full of roses. Thomas Hendricks had been a good man, strong and kind, with hands that could coax life from stubborn soil and a laugh that could fill a room. They'd had 3 years together before the mine took him, a tunnel collapse that killed 6 men and left 6 widows to fend for themselves. The town had helped at first, the way small communities do when tragedy strikes. But charity has a short memory, and within a year the sympathy had dried up like the creek bed. Martha took in boarders to survive, offering clean rooms and hot meals to travelers passing through. She charged little because she couldn't bear to turn away anyone who needed a place to rest. This generosity, which should have been admired, instead became another reason for the town to look down on her. "She's too soft," Mrs. Keene at the mercantile would say, her voice dripping with disdain. "Let's drifters stay for free, feeds vagrants who won't work. No wonder she's always scraping by." Martha heard the whispers, but never responded to them. She went about her days with quiet dignity, rising before dawn to bake bread, sweeping the boarding house steps, tending her small vegetable garden behind the building. She mended clothes for those who couldn't afford new ones and asked nothing in return. She sat with old Jacob Thornton when his rheumatism kept him bedridden, reading to him from his worn Bible. She brought soup to the widow Hanson when fever laid her low. The town took these kindnesses and gave back nothing but judgment. Sheriff Dalton, a man whose primary qualification for the job was that nobody else wanted it, barely acknowledged Martha's existence. When she reported a broken fence or suspicious activity near her property, he'd nod absently and do nothing. Mayor Pritchard, who fancied himself a sophisticated man despite never having traveled more than 50 miles from where he was born, referred to Martha as "that woman" when he spoke of her in council meetings, as if her name itself was too much effort to remember. But Martha endured. She wore her late husband's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. The band had grown too small for her fingers years ago, and she touched it sometimes when she thought no one was watching. It was tarnished now, the gold dulled by time, but it remained her most precious possession. A reminder that she had once been loved, once been valued, once been seen as worthy. What Martha didn't know was that someone had been seeing her all along. Ezra Cole lived in the mountains east of Redemption Springs, in a cabin he'd built himself from timber he'd felled and stones he'd carried up from the valley. He was a man of early 50s, though like Martha, the years sat heavy on him. His face was weathered like old leather, his hands scarred from a lifetime of hard work, his body lean and strong from a life that demanded constant physical effort. He came to town once a month, sometimes less, riding down from the high country on a sturdy mare named Ruth. He bought his supplies at the mercantile, flour, salt, ammunition, tobacco for his pipe, and he paid in gold dust or coins that he kept in a leather pouch tied to his belt. He spoke little, nodded politely, and left as quietly as he came. Most folks in Redemption Springs couldn't have told you much about Ezra Cole. He'd appeared in the territory about 15 years back, built his cabin and kept to himself. He trapped in winter, panned for gold in summer, and hunted year-round. He never caused trouble, never drank to excess, never involved himself in town affairs. He was, in the estimation of Redemption Springs, exactly the kind of man you could ignore. But Ezra had learned long ago that being ignored was a kind of freedom. He'd first noticed Martha Hendricks 2 years back. On a sweltering afternoon in July, he'd been loading supplies onto his pack mule outside the mercantile when he heard shouting from across the street. A group of young men, ranch hands with too much time and too little sense, had cornered a Chinese railroad worker named Lin Chen. They were shoving him, calling him names, working themselves up to something uglier. Ezra had started to move toward the commotion when someone else beat him to it. Martha Hendricks. All 5 feet and 4 inches of her had stepped between the railroad worker and his tormentors. Her voice had cut through their jeering like a knife through cloth. "That's enough. You boys go on home now." One of the ranch hands, a kid named Danny Pollard with more swagger than brains, had laughed in her face. "This ain't your concern, old woman. Go back to your kitchen." Martha hadn't moved. "I said that's enough. Lin Chen pays for a room at my boarding house. He's under my roof, which makes him under my protection. You want to bully someone, you'll have to go through me first." The young men had looked at each other uncertain. Hitting a woman, even one they considered beneath notice, crossed a line that even their limited sense of decency wouldn't allow. They'd backed off with muttered insults and scattered into the afternoon heat. Martha had turned to Lin Chen, asked if he was hurt, and walked him back to the boarding house with her hand on his elbow like he was a gentleman and she was a lady. Ezra had watched the whole thing from across the street, his hand resting on the lead rope of his mule. Something in that moment had shifted inside him. Here was a woman the town had dismissed, defending someone even more powerless than herself, expecting nothing in return. He'd started paying attention after that. On his monthly trips to town, he'd find himself looking for her. He saw her sweeping the boarding house steps, saw her in the mercantile, counting out coins for supplies, saw her walking to church on Sunday mornings with her Bible tucked under her arm. He noticed how she always had a kind word for the children, how she'd slip an apple or a biscuit to the ones whose families were struggling. He saw how the town treated her, the dismissive glances, the cruel comments spoken just loud enough for her to hear, and he saw how she held her head high despite it all. Ezra had known cruelty in his life. He'd seen what people were capable of when they convinced themselves someone else was less than human. He'd participated in that cruelty once, in another life, and the weight of those memories drove him into these mountains where he could hurt no one but himself, but watching Martha endure the town's casual contempt with such grace stirred something in him he thought had died years ago. It felt almost like hope. He never approached her directly. What would he say? How could he explain that he admired her without sounding like a fool? He was a mountain hermit with blood on his past and nothing to offer but a lonely cabin and a life of solitude. She was a woman who deserved better than the hand life had dealt her. Certainly better than anything he could provide, so he watched from a distance and told himself it was enough. On this particular morning in late August, Ezra sat on his horse at the edge of town, ostensibly checking his supply list, but really watching Martha through the window of her boarding house. She was kneading bread dough, her sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. Sunlight streamed through the window and caught the chain around her neck, making the tarnished wedding ring flash gold for just a moment. Ezra wondered what her husband had been like, what kind of man earned the devotion of a woman who still wore his ring 12 years after he'd been laid in the ground. He wondered if Thomas Hendricks had known how lucky he was, if he'd told Martha often enough that she was valued, that she mattered, that her kindness was a rare and precious thing in a hard world. Probably not. Most men didn't realize what they had until it was gone. Ruth shifted beneath him, impatient to get moving. Ezra gathered the reins and turned toward the mercantile. He had supplies to buy and a long ride back up the mountain ahead of him. But as he rode past the boarding house, he allowed himself one more glance at the window. Martha looked up at that exact moment, and their eyes met for just a second. Ezra touched the brim of his hat in a polite greeting. Martha smiled, a small, surprised smile, and nodded back. It was a brief exchange, meaningless to anyone watching. But Ezra carried that smile with him all the way back to his cabin, turning it over in his mind like a prospector examining a promising stone. He told himself he was being foolish, that he was too old and too broken for such thoughts, but he couldn't quite convince himself to stop thinking them. The mountain evening was cool and clear. Ezra sat on his porch with his pipe, looking out over the valley where the lights of Redemption Springs flickered like distant stars. He thought about Martha kneading bread in her kitchen, about the weight of that wedding ring around her neck, about the way she'd stood up for someone the world had cast aside. He thought about how sometimes the people who deserve love the most are the ones who receive it the least, and he made a quiet promise to himself. There in the gathering darkness, with only the stars as witness, if Martha Hendricks ever needed help, if she ever faced trouble she couldn't handle alone, he would be there. He didn't know that the time to make good on that promise was coming sooner than he could have imagined. The night settled over the mountains, and in the valley below, Redemption Springs slept on, unaware that the wheels of fate had already begun to turn. The notice appeared on Martha's door on a Tuesday morning, nailed there by the banker's assistant while she was at the mercantile buying flour. She returned to find a small crowd gathered on her porch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and poorly concealed satisfaction. The document was official, stamped with the territorial seal and signed by both the bank president and the mayor. The words were formal and cold, but their meaning was brutally simple. Martha Hendricks owed $340 in back taxes on her property. She had 30 days to pay in full, or the property would be seized and sold at auction to satisfy the debt. $340 might as well have been 3,000. It might as well have been the moon. Martha stood on her porch, reading the notice with trembling hands, while her neighbors watched. Mrs. Keene from the mercantile whispered something to Mrs. Porter from the dress shop, and both women shook their heads with that particular expression people wear when they're pretending sympathy, but really feeling superior. "Well," Mrs. Keene said, loud enough for Martha to hear, "I suppose this was inevitable. Can't run a business on charity and good intentions." Martha carefully unpinned the notice from her door. Her fingers felt numb, disconnected from her body. She folded the paper once, twice, 3 times, making it smaller as if that might somehow make the problem smaller too. "Excuse me," she said quietly, and went inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. She made it to her bedroom before her legs gave out. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the notice clutched in her hands, and tried to understand how her life had come to this moment. The room was small and simple. A bed, a dresser, a rocking chair that had been Thomas's, and a window that looked out on her vegetable garden. Everything she owned in the world could fit in 2 trunks. And now she was going to lose even this. The mathematics were merciless. She earned perhaps $10 a month from her boarders, and most of that went immediately to food and basic maintenance. She had $4.60 in a coffee tin under her bed. Even if she stopped eating entirely, even if she turned away every act of charity and hoarded every penny, she couldn't possibly accumulate $340 in 30 days. The boarding house was all she had. Without it, she would be homeless, dependent on the charity of a town that had already made clear what it thought of her. Martha touched the wedding ring hanging from the chain around her neck. What would Thomas think if he could see her now? Would he be disappointed that she'd failed to hold on to what little they'd built together? Or would he understand that she'd done her best in a world that seemed determined to grind down anyone who showed kindness? She sat there until the afternoon light slanting through her window turned golden, then orange, then deep purple. Her boarders would need dinner soon. Old Jacob would want his usual spot by the stove, and Lin Chen would return from his work on the railroad. Tommy Sullivan, the young drifter who was staying in the back room, would come in hungry as always. They depended on her, and she couldn't let her own crisis interfere with their needs. Martha stood, smoothed her skirts, and went to the kitchen to start cooking. Word spread through Redemption Springs, the way news always did in small towns, quickly and with embellishments. By evening, everyone knew about Martha's eviction notice. The saloon buzzed with speculation about who might buy the property at auction. The mayor's wife mentioned to several people that the location was quite good, really, and with proper management could be quite profitable. Nobody mentioned helping Martha pay the debt. The next morning, Martha began her campaign to save her home. She swallowed her pride, what little remained of it, and went door to door through the town, offering her services. She could take in laundry, she told Mrs. Porter. She could bake bread for the saloon, she told the owner. She could clean houses, mind children, tend gardens, anything at all. The responses varied from polite refusal to open mockery, but they all amounted to the same thing. "No, I do my own laundry, thank you," said Mrs. Porter, as if Martha had suggested something scandalous. "We've got all the bread we need," said the saloon owner. Not meeting her eyes, Mayor Pritchard's wife actually laughed. "My dear woman, I couldn't possibly trust my home to—" "Well, you understand." Martha understood perfectly. She tried the bank next, asking if there might be some arrangement, some payment plan that would allow her to keep her home while she worked to settle the debt. Mr. Garrison, the bank president, listened to her request with the expression of a man enduring an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said, his tone professionally sympathetic in the way that meant he felt no actual sympathy at all. "The taxes are 3 years in arrears. The bank has been more than patient. If we made exceptions for everyone who fell behind, we'd be out of business within a month. I understand that, Mr. Garrison, but surely the terms are quite clear. $340 in 30 days, or the property goes to auction." He stood, indicating the meeting was over. "I'm sorry, but business is business." Martha left the bank, feeling smaller than when she'd entered. She walked past the mercantile, past the saloon, past the church with its crooked steeple. She walked all the way to the cemetery at the south end of town and stood before Thomas's grave. The headstone was simple. Thomas Hendricks, 1827–1870, beloved husband. She'd paid for it with money borrowed from the bank, money she was still paying back 12 years later. Or rather, money she would never finish paying back now. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the grave. "I tried. I really did try." The wind moved through the dry grass, making a sound like whispered conversations. Martha stood there until the sun began to set, then walked slowly back to town. What she didn't know was that someone had witnessed the posting of the eviction notice that morning. Ezra Cole had been in town early, selling some gold dust at the assay office, when he saw the banker's assistant nail the document to Martha's door. He'd watched from across the street as the crowd gathered, as Martha returned and read the notice. As her face went pale and still, he'd been too far away to read the notice itself. But he didn't need to see the words to understand their meaning. The official seal, the banker's involvement, Martha's reaction, it could only mean one thing. Ezra finished his business at the assay office and went to the saloon. where information flowed as freely as whiskey. Within an hour, he knew everything. The amount owed, the deadline, the town's gleeful anticipation of Martha's failure. He sat at a corner table, nursing a single beer and listening to the conversations around him. $340, someone said with a laugh. She'll never raise that kind of money. About time someone took that property and made something of it, said another. Voice. Should have thought about that before she fed. Every vagrant in the territory, added a third. Ezra's hand tightened around his beer glass. He wanted to stand up and tell these people exactly what he thought of them. He wanted to explain that Martha Hendricks had more decency in her smallest finger than the lot of them had combined. He wanted to make them see what he saw when he looked at her. But he was a man who'd learned long ago that actions mattered more than words. That evening, Ezra rode back to his cabin and did something he'd never done before. He took inventory of everything he owned. His cabin and the land it sat on weren't really his. He was a squatter, technically, though nobody had challenged his claim in 15 years. His horse, his mule, his traps and tools and weapons, his clothes, his few books, his pipe and tobacco, and his savings. Ezra had been putting aside gold and coins for 15 years. He lived simply, needed little, and saved everything he didn't absolutely require. He'd never had a clear purpose for the money. He'd told himself it was for emergencies, for old age, for the day when he could no longer trap or hunt and would need something to live on. He poured it all out on his table, gold dust in leather pouches, coins in various denominations, a few small nuggets he'd found over the years. He counted it carefully, making neat stacks. $362.40, enough to pay Martha's debt with a little left over. Ezra sat back in his chair and stared at the money. This represented 15 years of hard work, of cold winters and dangerous hunts, of solitary prospecting in remote streams. This was his security, his safety net, everything he had to show for a decade and a half of life in these mountains. He could pay Martha's debt and have less than $25 left to his name. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through a war and its aftermath, told him this was foolish. He didn't really know Martha. She'd never spoken more than a few words to him. She certainly didn't know about his feelings, such as they were. And even if he paid her debt, what then? She'd never know who helped her. His life would continue exactly as it had been, except he'd be broke and vulnerable. But there was another part of Ezra, a part that had been buried for a long time under layers of grief and guilt and self-imposed isolation. That part remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond mere survival. That part had been slowly waking up over the past 2 years. Every time he saw Martha show kindness to someone the world had discarded, that part reminded him that he'd promised himself, just a few nights ago, that he would help her if she ever needed it. Ezra Cole had been many things in his life: a soldier, a killer, a hermit, a coward. But he'd never been the kind of man who broke a promise to himself. He began carefully putting the money back into pouches, counting out exactly $340. The rest, $22.40, he set aside. Tomorrow morning he would ride to Redemption Springs and pay Martha's debt. He wouldn't tell her it was him. He'd make that a condition of the payment. Let her think some distant relative sent money, or that some anonymous benefactor had taken pity on her. Let her keep her dignity intact. As for him, he'd go back to his cabin and his traps and his solitary life. He'd live more carefully, stretch his remaining money further, maybe take on some odd jobs in town if necessary. He'd survive. He always had, but Martha would keep her home. And somehow, that seemed worth any sacrifice he might have to make. Ezra lay in his bed that night, listening to the wind in the pines outside his cabin. He thought about the look on Martha's face when she'd read that eviction notice, the way her hands had trembled, the way she'd held herself together despite the crowd of gawkers. He thought about her wedding ring catching the sunlight through her kitchen window. He thought about how, for the first time in 15 years, he was about to do something that mattered. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally arrived, Ezra slept more peacefully than he had in a very long time. Ezra arrived in Redemption Springs just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. The town was still mostly asleep, just a few early risers moving about their morning routines. Smoke rose from a handful of chimneys, and the smith's hammer was already ringing out its steady rhythm from the livery. The bank wouldn't open for another hour, but Ezra could wait. He tied Ruth to the hitching post outside and sat on the bench beneath the bank's narrow porch overhang. The leather pouch containing Martha's salvation, $340 in gold dust and coins, rested heavy in his coat pocket. As the town slowly came to life around him, people began to notice the mountain man sitting outside the bank. Ezra was used to curious glances, but this morning the looks lingered longer than usual. A man sitting outside a bank before it opened meant money, and money always drew attention in a town where most folks barely scraped by. Mrs. Keene passed on her way to open the mercantile. She gave Ezra a long, appraising look but said nothing. Two ranch hands rode past, whispering to each other and glancing back at him. Old Jacob Thornton shuffled by with his cane, nodded a greeting, and continued toward Martha's boarding house for his breakfast. Ezra waited. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mr. Garrison arrived, a ring of keys jangling at his belt. He was a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the kind of face that looked like it rarely smiled. He stopped when he saw Ezra on the bench. "Mr. Cole," he said, surprised. "You're here early. Do you have business with the bank?" "I do," Ezra replied, standing. His knees protested slightly. He'd been sitting still too long in the morning chill. Garrison unlocked the door and gestured for Ezra to enter. The bank was a small affair. Just one main room with Garrison's desk, a teller's window, and a large safe in the back. Everything smelled of paper and ink, and the peculiar mustiness of old money. "How can I help you?" Garrison asked, settling behind his desk. Ezra pulled the leather pouch from his pocket and set it on the desk with a solid thump. "I'm here to settle a debt." Garrison's eyebrows rose. "Your debt? I wasn't aware you had any accounts with us, Mr. Cole. Not mine. Martha Hendricks's debt." The banker's expression shifted from surprise to something more calculating. He reached for the pouch, but didn't open it yet. "Mrs. Hendricks's property taxes, $340. You're here to pay it?" "That's right. May I ask why?" "Does it matter?" Garrison leaned back in his chair, studying Ezra with new interest. "It's unusual, that's all. Mrs. Hendricks didn't mention having anyone who might help her. Family back east, perhaps?" "The money's good," Ezra said evenly. "That's all that should concern you." Garrison opened the pouch and began counting. He did it slowly, methodically, making neat stacks of coins on his desk and measuring out the gold dust on his small scale. The process took nearly 20 minutes. During which neither man spoke. The only sounds were the clink of coins and the scratch of Garrison's pen as he made notes. Finally, Garrison looked up. $340 exactly. The debt is satisfied. "Good," Ezra said, starting to rise. "There is, however, the matter of the receipt and the record. How should I note this payment? Shall I tell Mrs. Hendricks you were the one who—" "No," Ezra's voice was firm. "She doesn't need to know it was me." Garrison's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "You want this to be anonymous?" "I do. That's going to cost you extra." "Privacy has a price, Mr. Cole." Ezra felt his jaw tighten. Of course. Of course this man would find a way to extract more money from an act of kindness. "How much?" "Let's call it $5. For the additional paperwork and discretion, it was extortion, plain and simple, but Ezra had little choice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 5 of his remaining $22. The coins felt heavier than they should as he placed them on the desk. Garrison swept them into his drawer with practiced efficiency. "I'll record the payment as coming from an anonymous benefactor. Mrs. Hendricks will be notified that her debt has been satisfied, but she won't know by whom. Is that satisfactory?" "It is." "Very well." Garrison pulled out a ledger and began writing. "This is quite generous of you, Mr. Cole. May I ask what your relationship is to Mrs. Hendricks?" "You may not." Garrison's pen paused for just a moment before continuing. When he finished writing, he looked up at Ezra with an expression that somehow managed to be both knowing and disdainful. "You understand, of course, that she'll likely never know what you've done for her. There's no recognition in anonymity, no gratitude." "Don't need any," Ezra said quietly. "Still," Garrison continued, as if Ezra hadn't spoken, "it's a remarkable sacrifice. $340 is a considerable sum. That's what several years of savings for a man in your position. You've essentially made yourself poor to save a woman who doesn't even know you've helped her." Ezra met the banker's eyes directly. "Are we finished here?" "We are." Garrison slid a receipt across the desk. "This confirms the payment. I'll have the notice removed from Mrs. Hendricks's door this afternoon and inform her that the debt has been settled." Ezra took the receipt, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his pocket. He had no real use for it, but something made him want to keep it. Proof, perhaps, that he'd done at least one entirely good thing in his life. As he reached the door, Garrison called out, "Mr. Cole, for what it's worth, I think what you've done is either remarkably noble or remarkably foolish." Possibly both. Ezra didn't respond. He simply opened the door and stepped back out into the morning sunlight. The town was fully awake now. More people moved along the street, and Ezra could feel their eyes on him as he walked to where Ruth waited patiently at the hitching post. The whispers had already started. People had seen him enter the bank with obvious purpose and were drawing their own conclusions. He untied Ruth and prepared to mount, but a voice stopped him. Ezra Cole. He turned to find Tommy Sullivan, the young drifter who boarded at Martha's place. Tommy couldn't have been more than 20, with the kind of open, honest face that suggested he hadn't yet learned how cruel the world could be. "Mr. Cole," Tommy said again, a bit breathless from hurrying over. "I saw you come out of the bank. Did you just—" Ezra cut him off with a look. "I was conducting private business. Nothing that concerns anyone else." Tommy's eyes widened with understanding. "It was you. You paid her debt, didn't you? I don't know what you're talking about, but I saw you go in with that pouch. And everyone knows about Mrs. Hendricks owing money to the bank." And Ezra stepped closer, his voice low and serious. "Listen to me carefully, son. Whatever you think you saw or figured out, you keep it to yourself. Mrs. Hendricks doesn't need to know, and she's not going to know. Understood?" Tommy nodded slowly. "But why? Why would you do that and not want anyone to know?" "Because some things are better done quietly. Now go on back to your breakfast and forget you saw me here." Tommy hesitated, then nodded again. "Yes, sir. But Mr. Cole, what you did, if you did it, that's about the finest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Ezra mounted Ruth without responding. He turned the horse toward the edge of town, ready to put Redemption Springs behind him and return to his familiar solitude. But as he rode past Martha's boarding house, he couldn't help glancing at the door. The eviction notice was still there, but by this afternoon it would be gone. Martha would come home to find her crisis resolved by mysterious means, and her life would continue in that building with its peeling paint and crooked porch steps. The thought brought a small, private satisfaction that settled somewhere in the region of his chest. The ride back to his cabin took most of the day. Ezra had time to think about what he'd done, to turn it over in his mind and examine it from every angle. He'd given away nearly everything he'd saved, reduced himself to barely more than a beggar. If something happened now, if he got injured, if his traps failed, if game became scarce, he had almost nothing to fall back on. It was, by any rational measure, a foolish thing to have done, but rationality had never been much comfort on cold nights. And Ezra found he didn't regret his decision. Not yet, anyway. Maybe regret would come later, when winter arrived and his supplies ran thin. Maybe he'd curse himself then for throwing away his security on a woman who didn't even know his name. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd done something that mattered more than mere survival. Back in Redemption Springs, the news spread like fire through dry grass. Someone had paid Martha Hendricks's debt. An anonymous benefactor had walked into the bank and settled the entire sum in cash and gold dust. By noon, everyone in town was talking about it. Speculation ran wild. Some thought it must be family from back east. Others suggested a secret admirer, though who would admire someone like Martha was beyond most people's imagination. A few even whispered that maybe Martha herself had hidden money somewhere. Though that theory fell apart under the weight of her obvious poverty, nobody suspected the mountain. When Mr. Garrison's assistant removed the eviction notice from Martha's door at 2 o'clock that afternoon, he knocked and waited for Martha to answer. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said, consulting a document in his hand, "I'm here to inform you that your property taxes have been paid in full. Your debt to the bank is satisfied." Martha stared at him. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your debt. It's been paid. Someone came in this morning and settled the entire amount." "Who?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm not at liberty to say." The benefactor wished to remain anonymous. Martha's legs felt suddenly unsteady. She reached out and gripped the doorframe for support. "I don't understand." "Someone paid all of it?" $340, yes, ma'am. "You're free and clear." The assistant handed her a document. "This is your receipt showing the payment and the cancellation of the seizure order. The property remains yours." He tipped his hat and left, leaving Martha standing in her doorway with a piece of paper that suddenly felt as heavy as an anchor. She went inside and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the receipt. Her hands were shaking. $340. Someone had given $340 to save her home, but who? And why? The question spun through her mind like a dust devil. She had no family left alive, no wealthy friends, no one who owed her anything. She thought back through every person she'd helped over the years, wondering if someone she'd shown kindness to had come into money and decided to repay her. But that seemed impossible. Most of the people she'd helped were as poor as she was. Old Jacob came in for his afternoon cup of tea and found Martha still sitting at the table. The receipt laid out in front of her like a puzzle she couldn't solve. "You heard?" "Then," Jacob said, lowering himself carefully into his usual chair, "I heard. I just don't understand. Maybe you don't need to understand. Maybe you just need to accept it as a blessing." Martha looked up at him. "But who would do such a thing? Who in this town would give away that kind of money for me?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his teacup. "I've lived a long time, Martha. Long enough to know that sometimes goodness shows up in unexpected places. Maybe someone saw your worth, even if the rest of this town was too blind to notice. But everyone in Redemption Springs, they all think. I know what they think. Doesn't make them right." Jacob sipped his tea slowly. "Someone out there sees you the way you deserve to be seen. That's a rare gift." Martha touched the wedding ring hanging from her neck. Thomas had seen her that way once. He'd looked at her with eyes that saw not just her appearance, but her heart. She'd thought that kind of seeing had died with him, but someone, somewhere, had looked at her situation and decided she was worth saving. The tears came then, unexpected and overwhelming. Martha put her head down on the table and wept, great shaking sobs of relief and confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. Jacob reached over and patted her hand gently, saying nothing, just being present while she released the fear she'd been carrying for days. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were red but clearer. "I'm going to find out who did this." "Why?" "Because I need to thank them. I need to tell them." She paused, searching for words. "I need them to know that what they did mattered, that I'm grateful, and if they wanted to be thanked, they wouldn't have paid anonymously," Jacob said gently. "Maybe respecting their wish for privacy is the best way to honor what they've done." Martha considered this. Part of her rebelled against the idea. She wanted answers, wanted to look her mysterious benefactor in the eye and express her gratitude properly. But another part recognized the wisdom in Jacob's words. Still, she couldn't just let it go. Not entirely. Over the next few days, Martha made it her mission to thank every person in Redemption Springs who might conceivably have helped her. She went door to door, expressing her gratitude to bemused or outright hostile townspeople. Most of them rejected the notion outright. "Why would I throw money away on you?" Mrs. Keene snapped. "Must have been someone from out of town," Mayor Pritchard said dismissively. "Beats me," said the saloon owner with a shrug. But Martha continued her rounds, determined to leave no possibility unexplored. If she couldn't identify her benefactor directly, she could at least make sure that every person who might have helped knew they were appreciated. She thought about Ezra Cole briefly. She'd seen him in town that morning, sitting outside the bank. But the idea was absurd. The mountain man barely spoke to anyone. Why would he pay her debt? Besides, where would someone like him get that kind of money? She dismissed the thought and continued her search. What she didn't know was that her mysterious benefactor was back in his mountain cabin, rationing his supplies more carefully than he had in years, and wondering if the woman he'd saved would ever know the truth. 2 weeks passed. Martha's investigation continued with quiet determination, though each dead end left her more puzzled than before. She kept the receipt in her Bible, pressed between the pages like a pressed flower, a reminder that someone, somewhere, had seen her as worthy of saving. Life at the boarding house returned to its familiar rhythms. She rose before dawn to bake bread, tended her garden, cleaned rooms, and prepared meals. But something had shifted inside her. The shadow of the eviction notice had lifted, and with it had gone some of the heaviness she'd carried for years. She caught herself humming sometimes while she worked, surprised by the sound of her own voice, making something resembling music. Old Jacob noticed. "You seem lighter," he observed one morning over breakfast. "I suppose I am. For the first time in a long while, I'm not afraid of losing everything." "Fear's a heavy burden to carry," Jacob said. "Nice to set it down for a bit." Martha smiled and refilled his coffee cup. Through the window, she could see the morning sun painting the mountains to the east in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere up there in those distant peaks lived the man she'd barely spoken to, but who'd looked at her with something like respect in his eyes. She thought about Ezra Cole more than she cared to admit. That same morning, Ezra made his way down from the mountains for his monthly supply run. His provisions were running lower than usual. He'd been stretching everything further, making do with less. His remaining money wouldn't go far, but he'd calculated carefully. If he bought only essentials and hunted successfully, he could make it through to winter. He arrived in Redemption Springs just before noon, when the sun was high and hot, and the town was at its busiest. He tied Ruth to the hitching post outside the mercantile and went inside. His mental list already prepared: flour, salt, coffee if he could afford it, ammunition for his rifle. Mrs. Keene watched him enter with her usual suspicious expression. She'd never liked Ezra. She didn't like anyone who kept to themselves, but his money was good, so she tolerated his presence. Ezra gathered his supplies efficiently, keeping to the bare necessities. When he brought them to the counter, Mrs. Keene tallied up the cost with pursed lips. "That'll be $6.30. Ezra counted out the money carefully from his dwindling reserves. As Mrs. Keene was wrapping his purchases, the door opened and Martha Hendricks walked in. She carried a basket over one arm and seemed focused on her own errands. But when she noticed Ezra at the counter, she paused. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and Ezra felt that same strange tightening in his chest he'd felt every time he saw her. "Mr. Cole," Martha said, her voice warm. "Good afternoon." "Ma'am," Ezra replied, touching the brim of his hat. Martha moved to the counter, setting her basket down. She had a list in her hand, and Mrs. Keene's expression soured slightly at the sight of her. "I'll be with you when I'm finished with Mr. Cole," Mrs. Keene said, her tone suggesting it might be quite a while. "Of course," Martha said pleasantly. She seemed unbothered by the woman's rudeness, which only made Mrs. Keene more irritated. Ezra gathered his wrapped supplies, aware that he should leave but somehow reluctant to do so. Martha stood close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap and fresh bread. "Mr. Cole," Martha said suddenly, "I wonder if I might ask you something." Ezra felt his heart skip. Did she know? Had she somehow figured out what he'd done? "Ma'am, you come down from the mountains once a month or so, isn't that right?" "Usually, yes. And you live up there alone." "In a cabin you built yourself?" "That's right." Martha smiled, and Ezra noticed for the first time that she had a small dimple in her left cheek. "That must be a difficult life." "Lonely, I imagine." "It suits me well enough. I'm sure it does." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I was wondering, and please tell me if this is too forward, but would you consider staying for a meal? At the boarding house, I mean. I prepare dinner for my boarders every evening, and there's always more than enough. You'd be welcome to join us. No charge, of course. Mrs. Keene made a small, disapproving sound, which both Martha and Ezra ignored. Ezra's first instinct was to refuse. He wasn't comfortable around groups of people, didn't like the attention that came with being in social situations. But Martha was looking at him with such genuine kindness in her eyes, such honest welcome, that he found himself hesitating. I don't want to impose, he said finally. It wouldn't be an imposition. Truly. I enjoy cooking for people, and I'd like to repay— She stopped, corrected herself. That is, I'd like to do something kind for someone who— She paused again, seeming frustrated with her own words. I'd simply like you to stay for a meal, Mr. Cole, if you're willing. There was something in the way she spoke, some subtext he couldn't quite interpret. It felt almost like she was trying to tell him something without saying it directly. All right, Ezra heard himself say. I'd be obliged. Martha's smile widened. Wonderful. Dinner is at 6 o'clock. The boarding house is, but you know where it is, of course. I do. Then I'll see you this evening. Ezra nodded, gathered his supplies, and left the mercantile in something of a daze. He'd just agreed to have dinner at Martha's boarding house, to sit at a table with strangers and make conversation like a normal person. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and strangely appealing. He spent the afternoon attending to various errands around town, but his mind kept returning to the evening ahead. He hadn't shared a meal with anyone in years. What did people talk about over dinner? What if he said something foolish? What if Martha regretted inviting him? As 6 o'clock approached, Ezra found himself standing on the street outside the boarding house, his hand resting on Ruth's neck for comfort. The building looked warm and inviting in the early evening light. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he could smell something delicious. Beef stew, maybe, and fresh bread. He could still leave. He could mount Ruth and ride back to his cabin and his solitude. Send word later that something came up. Martha would understand, or at least she'd accept his absence without complaint, but he'd made a promise, even if only a small one. And Ezra Cole, whatever his other failings, tried to keep his promises. He tied Ruth to the porch rail and knocked on the door. The dinner at Martha's boarding house marked a turning point, though neither Ezra nor Martha fully understood it at the time. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them, not dramatic or sudden, but gentle and persistent, like water slowly shaping stone. Martha found herself thinking about the mountain man more than was probably sensible. She wondered about his solitary life in the high country, about what had driven him to seek such isolation. She thought about the careful way he'd dried dishes in her kitchen, the honest words he'd spoken about what he saw when he looked at her, the shadows that crossed his face when the war was mentioned. She decided she wanted to know more about Ezra Cole. Her investigation began subtly. One afternoon, she brought tea to old Jacob and steered the conversation toward the town's history and the people who'd passed through over the years. You've been here longer than most. Jacob, you must remember when Ezra first arrived. Jacob sipped his tea thoughtfully. I do, actually. Must have been 67 or 68. He came down from the north, riding that same mare he's got now, though she was younger then, of course. Built himself a cabin up in the high country and just stayed. Did he ever say where he came from? What brought him here? Not in so many words, but I recognized the look in his eyes. I'd seen it in the mirror enough times myself. Jacob set down his cup. War does things to a man, Martha. Some come back and can't stop talking about it. Others come back and can't bear to talk about it at all. Ezra's the second kind. Did he see much combat? I'd wager he saw more than his share. There's a way a man moves when he's been trained to kill. Ezra's got that way about him even now. Careful, always aware of his surroundings. Never sits with his back to a door. Jacob paused. But I've also watched him gentle a spooked horse and handle injured animals with more kindness than most people show their own kin. Whatever he was in the war, he's trying hard not to be that anymore. Martha absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture she had of Ezra, a soldier who'd become a hermit, a man trained for violence who chose isolation instead, someone carrying weight he couldn't set down. She began leaving packages for him at the mercantile, not elaborate, just small gestures of kindness. A loaf of fresh bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves from her garden, a shirt she'd mended after noticing it was torn when he'd come to dinner. Mrs. Keene accepted these packages with barely concealed disapproval. "You know he's just a mountain man, Martha. Probably doesn't even appreciate what you're doing." "That's not why I do it," Martha replied calmly. The first time Ezra found one of her packages waiting for him, he stood at the mercantile counter for a long moment, just staring at it. Mrs. Keene watched him with obvious curiosity. "The Hendricks woman left it for you," she said, her tone suggesting this was somehow scandalous. Ezra picked up the package carefully, as if it might break. Inside was bread, still faintly warm, and a note in careful handwriting. "Thank you for the company at dinner. You're welcome any time. M.H." He tucked the note into his pocket and carried the bread out to Ruth with something uncomfortably close to emotion tightening his throat. Over the next few weeks, more packages appeared. Each one contained something simple but thoughtful, and each one made Ezra feel increasingly like he was receiving far more than he deserved. He didn't know how to reciprocate properly. His skills lay in survival, not in social niceties, but he tried. He left a bundle of firewood on Martha's porch one night, cut and split to the perfect size for her stove. He dropped off fresh venison at the boarding house, claiming he'd shot more than he could use before it spoiled. He fixed her broken fence gate without being asked, working quickly in the early morning before she woke. Martha noticed every gesture. Each one added another piece to the puzzle of Ezra Cole, and each one made her more certain of something she was almost afraid to acknowledge. This man cared about her. The question that still nagged at her was whether he'd cared enough to pay her debt. But before Martha could pursue that question further, new trouble arrived in Redemption Springs. The first rumors came from travelers passing through, talk of a gang of cattle rustlers working their way through the territory. They'd hit several ranches to the north, stealing livestock and supplies, leaving destruction in their wake. The territorial marshal was supposedly tracking them, but so far they'd stayed one step ahead of the law. Most folks in Redemption Springs weren't too worried. They had no cattle to speak of, and the town was small enough to be beneath the notice of serious criminals. But Sheriff Dalton, for all his limitations, knew enough to be concerned. "These aren't just rustlers," he told Mayor Pritchard at an emergency town council meeting. "They're a full criminal gang, led by a man named Jack Calhoun. He's got a reputation, violence, intimidation, worse things than stealing cattle. But surely they'll pass us by," Pritchard said hopefully. "We've got nothing worth taking. We've got a bank. We've got supplies. We've got women." Dalton's face was grim. "And we've got almost no way to defend ourselves if they decide to stop here." Word of the threat spread quickly through town. Some families began making plans to leave temporarily, to stay with relatives in other towns until the danger passed. Others barricaded their homes and hoped for the best. The general mood shifted from the town's usual resignation to active fear. Martha heard the news from Tommy, who came back from the saloon with wild eyes and breathless updates. "They say Calhoun's gang has at least a dozen men, all of them mean as snakes. They say he once burned down a whole ranch just because the owner looked at him wrong. Mrs. Hendricks, maybe you should go stay with someone outside of town for a while." "And leave my home? My borders?" Martha shook her head. "This is where I belong, Tommy. I'm not running." "But what if they come here? What if they—" He couldn't finish the thought. "Then we'll deal with it when it happens. I've survived worse than rough men. I'll survive this too." Her confidence was partly genuine and partly performance. The truth was, Martha was frightened. She'd heard enough stories about gangs like Calhoun's to know what they were capable of. But she'd spent too many years fighting to keep her home, to abandon it now out of fear. That evening, she pulled out her most precious possession besides the wedding ring, her Bible. It had been Thomas's, and it was filled with his handwritten notes in the margins. observations and prayers and small pressed flowers from their early years together. She held it in her lap and tried to pray for protection, for wisdom, for courage. The words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself thinking about Ezra Cole, alone in his mountain cabin, probably unaware of the threat approaching. Should someone warn him? Not that a hermit needed to worry about gang activity in town, but still, it seemed right that he should know. She was still contemplating this when she heard hoofbeats outside. Martha went to the window and saw a rider approaching. Not one of the feared gang members, but Ezra himself. He was riding hard, faster than she'd ever seen him move. He pulled up at her porch and dismounted in one fluid motion. Martha opened the door before he could knock. Ezra. What's wrong? Spotted riders coming this way from the north. 5, maybe 6 men, heavily armed. They're not ranchers, and they're not settlers. His voice was calm but urgent. I think the gang everyone's been talking about is heading for Redemption Springs. When? Tomorrow, maybe the day after. Depends on how fast they're moving. He paused. Martha, you need to leave town. Tonight, if possible. I'm not leaving. This isn't the time for stubbornness. These men are dangerous. I know they're dangerous. That's why I can't leave. Old Jacob can barely walk. Lynchon has nowhere else to go. Tommy's too young and foolish to know when he's in over his head. If I leave, what happens to them? Ezra looked at her for a long moment, and Martha saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It was fear, but not for himself. He was afraid for her. Then I'm staying too, he said finally. Ezra, you don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm. I'm not going back up that mountain knowing you're down here, facing this alone. Martha felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. Why? Why would you do that? Ezra seemed to struggle with the answer. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. Because some things matter more than safety. Some people matter more than common sense. And I'd rather face whatever's coming standing beside you than spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have helped and didn't. They stood there on her porch in the gathering dusk. And Martha understood with sudden clarity that whatever this was between them, friendship, loyalty, something deeper, it was real and worth protecting. All right, she said. We'll face it together. But Ezra, promise me you'll be careful. I've lost enough people I care about. I promise, he said, and meant it. He stayed that night in one of the empty rooms at the boarding house. Martha insisted, and Ezra didn't argue. They sat up late in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking in quiet voices about the gang, about defensive plans, about what might happen, but they also talked about other things. Martha asked about Ezra's life before the war, and he told her fragments. His family's farm in Pennsylvania, his younger sister who'd died of fever, his father who'd been proud when Ezra enlisted and broken when he'd come home changed. I couldn't stay there, Ezra said. Not after what I'd seen, what I'd done. My mother tried to understand, but how could she? How could anyone who hadn't been there? So you came west, as far as I could go. Figured if I put enough distance between myself and the war, maybe I could outrun it. He smiled without humor. Didn't work. You can't outrun what's inside you. Martha reached across the table and took his hand. Maybe you're not supposed to outrun it. Maybe you're supposed to live with it and find a way to be something more than just what the war made you. Ezra looked down at their joined hands, her small, soft palm against his calloused one. Is that what you did? After you lost your husband? I tried. Some days were easier than others. But I learned that grief doesn't disappear. You just learn to carry it differently. And eventually, if you're lucky, you find new reasons to keep going. What are your reasons? Martha thought about it. The people who need me. The small kindnesses I can offer. The garden I tend, and the meals I cook, and the rooms I keep clean. It's not much, but it's mine. It matters. It matters, Ezra agreed quietly. More than you know. They sat together in comfortable silence until the kitchen window showed the first grey light of approaching dawn. Then Ezra stood, stretched his stiff muscles, and began preparing for whatever the day might bring. What neither of them knew was that the gang was closer than Ezra had estimated. Jack Calhoun and his men had ridden through the night and were already camped just a few miles outside of Redemption Springs, making their final plans before descending on the unsuspecting town. The gang arrived at Redemption Springs just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. 5 men rode in first, spreading out along the main street with practiced ease, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. They had the look of men who'd done this before, confident, predatory, already assessing the town for weaknesses. Then Jack Calhoun himself rode in. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, with a scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheek to his jaw. His eyes were pale blue and cold as winter ice. He wore good clothes, a fine leather vest, polished boots, but they couldn't hide what he was. Violence clung to him like a smell. The townsfolk who were out on the street quickly found reasons to be elsewhere. Doors closed, window shutters latched. Within minutes, the main street of Redemption Springs had gone from sleepy afternoon bustle to tense, watchful silence. Calhoun rode slowly down the street, taking his time, letting everyone see him and understand what his presence meant. He stopped in front of the saloon, dismounted, and stretched elaborately. "Boys," he called out to his men, "I think we found ourselves a nice, quiet place to rest for a spell." Sheriff Dalton, to his credit, emerged from his office. His hand trembled slightly on his gun belt, but he stood his ground in the middle of the street. "I'm Sheriff Dalton. I'm going to have to ask you gentlemen to state your business and move along." Calhoun turned to look at him, and Dalton visibly flinched at the dead cold in those pale eyes. "Sheriff," Calhoun said, his voice pleasant and utterly devoid of warmth, "we're just passing through. Thought we'd stop for some supplies, maybe a drink or two. That a problem? Long as you don't cause trouble, I suppose that's fine." "Trouble?" Calhoun smiled. "Sheriff, we're as peaceful as Sunday morning. Right, boys?" His men laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "We'll need lodging," Calhoun continued. "That boarding house down the street still taking guests?" Dalton's face paled. I suppose so." "Good." Calhoun clapped the sheriff on the shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly but was clearly a display of dominance. "See, we're all going to get along just fine." From the window of the boarding house, Martha watched the exchange with growing dread. She'd heard the horses, seen the men ride in, and known immediately what they were. Ezra stood beside her, his body tense, his eyes tracking every movement the gang members made. "That's Calhoun," he said quietly. "The big one with the scar. How do you know?" "I've seen his type before. Wears his violence like a badge." Ezra's jaw tightened. "Martha, lock all the doors. Don't let any of them inside, no matter what they say. What about you?" "I'll be close. Just don't engage with them if you can help it." But before Martha could respond, there was a heavy knock on her door. Through the window, she could see 2 of Calhoun's men standing on her porch. "Mrs. Hendricks," one of them called out, his voice mockingly polite. "We hear you run a boarding house. We'd like to discuss accommodations." Martha looked at Ezra, who shook his head slightly, but she knew she couldn't simply refuse to answer. In a town this small, with these men this dangerous, the worst thing she could do was show overt defiance without the ability to back it up. She took a breath, touched the wedding ring at her throat for courage, and opened the door, but only a crack, her body blocking the entrance. "Gentlemen, how can I help you?" The man who'd knocked was lean and snake-like, with a thin moustache and calculating eyes. "Like I said, ma'am, we're looking for rooms. Boss wants us comfortable while we're in town. I'm afraid I'm fully booked at the moment." "That's so?" The man looked past her into the boarding house. "Looks pretty empty to me. My regular boarders can make room. We'll pay good money," he smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Real good money. I appreciate the offer, but as I said, I'm full up. Perhaps you could try being more hospitable," the man interrupted, his smile vanishing. "Boss doesn't like being refused." Martha felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not refusing. I simply don't have room." "That's not a judgment, just a fact." The second man, shorter and heavier, leaned against the porch rail. "You know, it'd be a shame if something happened to this place. Old building like this probably catches fire real easy." Before Martha could respond, Ezra appeared in the doorway behind her. He didn't push past her, but his presence was suddenly unmistakably there. "The lady said she's full up," he said calmly. "Best respect that." The 2 gang members looked at Ezra with new interest. The lean one's eyes narrowed. Who are you, old man? The lady's protector. Just a friend. And I'm suggesting you move along. You suggesting? The man laughed. That's real brave, considering there's 5 of us and 1 of you. I can count, Ezra said. Doesn't change what I said. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut. Martha could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew Ezra could handle himself. Everything about the way he stood suggested capability. But 5 armed men were 5 armed men. Then Calhoun's voice cut through the standoff. What's the holdup? Boys? The gang leader had walked down from the saloon, his boots making solid, deliberate sounds on the dusty street. He stopped at the base of Martha's porch steps and looked up at the scene with interest. Boss, the lean man said, this old woman says she's got no rooms, and her friend here thinks he can tell us what to do. Calhoun studied Ezra for a long moment. That right, friend? You think you can tell my boys what to do? I think, Ezra said carefully, that the lady has the right to refuse service to anyone she chooses. And I think your boys should respect that. The right? Calhoun smiled, but it was a terrible expression. Out here, rights are what men with guns say they are. He turned his attention to Martha, his eyes traveling slowly over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Well now, you're Mrs. Hendricks, I take it? Martha lifted her chin. I am. I've heard about you. The woman who feeds every vagrant and drifter who comes through. Real charitable type. He said the word charitable like it was something distasteful. So here's what we're going to do, Mrs. Hendricks. You're going to be charitable to me and my boys. We're going to stay here, eat your food, sleep in your beds, enjoy your hospitality. And in exchange, we won't burn your little town to the ground. Sound fair? Get off my property, Martha said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Calhoun's expression darkened. Excuse me? I said get off my property. You're not welcome here? For a moment, nobody moved. Then Calhoun took a step up onto the porch, and Ezra moved simultaneously, positioning himself between the gang leader and Martha. That's close enough, Ezra said quietly. Calhoun stopped, studying Ezra with new attention. You know what, friend? I'm starting to think you're more than just some old mountain hermit. There's something about the way you move. The way you talk. Military? Ezra didn't respond. Yeah, Calhoun continued, I thought so. Well, let me tell you something, soldier boy. Whatever you were in the war doesn't mean spit out here. Out here, I'm the law. I'm the judge, jury, and executioner. And if you keep standing in my way, you're going to find out just how quick I can end this little standoff. Maybe, Ezra said. But not before I end you. And I think you're smart enough to know that's true. The statement was delivered without bravado, without threat in the traditional sense. It was simply a statement of fact, spoken with the certainty of a man who'd killed before and could do it again. Calhoun heard that certainty, and for just a moment something flickered in his cold eyes. Not quite fear, but recognition. He was facing someone dangerous. Calhoun smiled again, but this time there was calculation in it. Well, maybe you're not as soft as you look, old man. Tell you what, we'll give you and your lady friend here a pass. For now, we'll make do with the saloon. But Mrs. Hendricks, he looked past Ezra to Martha. You and I aren't finished. Not by a long shot. He turned and walked back toward the saloon, his men following. But the lean one paused at the steps and looked back at Ezra. Boss might be patient, but I ain't. We're going to settle this, you and me. Count on it. Then they were gone, and Martha sagged against the doorframe, all the adrenaline draining out of her at once. Ezra caught her elbow, steadying her. Inside, he said gently, let's get everyone together and figure out what we're going to do. In the boarding house parlor, Martha's residents gathered. Old Jacob with his walking stick, Lin Chen looking terrified, Tommy trying to appear brave and failing. Ezra stood by the window watching the saloon where Calhoun and his men had taken over. We should leave, Lin Chen said quietly. While we still can. And go where? Jacob asked. By the time we get clear of town, they could run us down easy. Now running just makes you pray. Then what do we do? Tommy asked. There's 5 of them, and they're armed, and they clearly don't give a damn about the law. 6, Ezra corrected quietly. I counted 6 men total. Calhoun makes 7. That's even worse. Martha moved to the center of the room, her fear transformed into something more useful. Determination. We stay together. We keep the doors locked. We don't provoke them, but we don't give them what they want either. And what exactly do they want? Jacob asked. Control, Ezra said. Fear. They want everyone in this town to know they're in charge. He turned from the window. But they also want something else. Supplies, probably. Money from the bank, food. They'll take what they can get and then move on. That's how gangs like this work. So we just wait them out? Tommy sounded dubious. We stay alert. We prepare for trouble. And if trouble comes, Ezra met Martha's eyes, we deal with it. That night the town held its breath. Lights in the saloon burned late, and the sound of rough laughter drifted through the streets. Sheriff Dalton had barricaded himself in his office, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. Most families stayed in their homes with their doors locked and their lamps extinguished. At the boarding house, Ezra organized a watch. He took the first shift himself, sitting by the front window with his rifle across his knees. Martha brought him coffee around midnight and sat down in the chair beside him. You should be sleeping, he said. So should you. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the darkened street. The saloon had finally gone quiet, though lamplight still flickered in its windows. Ezra, Martha said eventually, what you did today, standing up to those men, that was brave. But it was also dangerous. You could have been killed. Could have. Didn't happen, though. But what if it had? What if Calhoun had drawn his gun? What if... Martha! Ezra set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. I spent 15 years up in those mountains, living alone, keeping to myself. I told myself it was because I wanted peace and quiet. But the truth is I was hiding. From people, from connection, from anything that might matter enough to hurt. He paused, choosing his words carefully. These past few weeks, since I started coming to dinner here, since we started, whatever this is we're doing, I've felt something I haven't felt in a long time. Like maybe there's still a point to being alive beyond just surviving another winter. And today, when I saw those men threatening you, I realized something. What? That I'd rather die protecting something that matters than live another day protecting nothing at all. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. I matter to you? You matter to me, Ezra confirmed quietly. More than is probably wise, given that I've got nothing to offer you but a run-down cabin and a past I can't outrun. But yes, you matter. Martha reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. You matter to me too, and you have more to offer than you think. They sat like that for a long while, hands joined, watching over the sleeping town together. It was the most intimate moment Martha had experienced since Thomas died, and it filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Joy because she'd thought she was too old, too worn down, too dismissed by the world to ever feel this kind of connection again. Terror because she'd already lost one man she loved, and the thought of losing another was almost unbearable. Ezra, she said softly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, all right? When my debt was paid, when someone walked into that bank and gave Mr. Garrison $340, was that you? Ezra went very still. In the darkness, Martha couldn't read his expression clearly, but she felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. Why do you think it was me? Because Tommy saw you at the bank that morning. Because you're the only person who's ever looked at me like I'm worth something. Because, her voice caught, because it's exactly the kind of thing you would do. Give away everything you have for someone you barely know and never expect anything in return. Ezra was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I couldn't let you lose your home, not when I had the means to stop it. And I couldn't tell you because what I did was selfish in a way. I didn't do it so you'd owe me. I did it because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. $340, Ezra. That's not selfish. That's... Martha struggled to find words. That's the most selfless thing anyone's ever done for me. It wasn't enough, though, was it? You still don't have any buffer, any safety. If something happens again, then I'll deal with it. But knowing that someone cared enough to help, that someone saw me as worth saving, Ezra, that changes everything. It's not about the money. It's about being seen. She lifted his hand and pressed it to her cheek. Thank you. For everything. For the debt. For standing up to those men today. For making me feel like I matter again. You've always mattered, Ezra said. The world was just too blind to see it. They sat together through the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch and talking in quiet voices about their lives, their regrets, their small hopes for whatever future might lie ahead. By the time dawn broke, something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just two lonely people circling each other cautiously. They were something more, partners maybe, or the beginning of something even deeper. The next day brought fresh trouble. Calhoun and his men emerged from the saloon around noon, hungover and mean-spirited. They began making demands of the town, supplies from the mercantile, money from the bank, food from anyone who had it. Sheriff Dalton tried to maintain some semblance of order, but was quickly and brutally put in his place. One of Calhoun's men pistol-whipped him in broad daylight, and the sheriff retreated to his office with blood running down his face. The message was clear. There was no law in Redemption Springs, except what Calhoun decided. Martha watched from her window as the gang terrorized her town. They weren't killing anyone yet, but the violence and intimidation were escalating. Mrs. Keene was forced to hand over half her inventory. The bank was emptied of what little money it held. Young Will Thornton, Jacob's nephew, was beaten for looking at one of the gang members the wrong way. "We have to do something," Tommy said, his fists clenched in frustration. "What can we do?" Lynchen asked hopelessly. "We're outnumbered and outgunned." "We wait," Ezra said, though his jaw was tight with suppressed anger. "We wait until they give us an opening." But that afternoon, Calhoun forced the issue. He appeared on Martha's porch again, this time alone. He knocked with exaggerated politeness, and when Martha opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged, he smiled at her with cold amusement. "Mrs. Hendricks, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday." "Have you?" "I have. And I've decided that your boarding house would make a much better headquarters for me and my boys than that flea-ridden saloon. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to open this door, you're going to invite us in real nice, and you're going to be a proper hostess. And if you don't," he leaned closer to the gap in the door, "I'm going to start hurting people you care about. Starting with that old cripple, Jacob, then maybe the Chinese fellow. Then that boy, Tommy, and I'll make sure you watch every minute of it." Martha felt ice spread through her veins. "You wouldn't?" "Oh, I would. And I'll enjoy it." He straightened up. "You've got until sundown to make your decision. Either you and your friend the mountain man clear out and give us this place, or I start making examples. Your choice." He walked away, whistling, leaving Martha shaking in her doorway. She closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. Ezra appeared from the kitchen, his expression grim. "You heard. Every word. He means it, Ezra. He'll hurt them. He'll hurt everyone just to prove he can." "I know." Ezra moved to the window, his hand resting on the brass compass he kept in his pocket, a gift from his father, carried through the war and into these mountains. "Which means we can't wait anymore. We have to act first." "Act how?" "There's 7 of them, and," Martha counted mentally, 5 of us. If you count Jacob and Lynn, which we probably shouldn't, it's suicide." "Maybe." Ezra turned to face her, and Martha saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The soldier he used to be, cold and calculating and utterly focused. "But I've fought longer odds before, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let that man hurt you or anyone else in this town. What are you going to do?" "What I should have done 15 years ago," Ezra said quietly. "Stop running from what I am and use it for something that matters." He began making plans, and as Martha listened, she realized with a mixture of awe and terror that Ezra Cole was far more than just a mountain hermit who'd paid her debt. He was a tactician, a strategist, a man who understood violence in ways most people never would, and he was preparing to go to war, for her borders, for this town that had never shown him anything but indifference. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains and sundown approached, Martha made her own decision. She wasn't going to hide while Ezra fought her battles. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. She touched the wedding ring at her throat one last time, thinking of Thomas and the life they'd had. Then she set it aside, carefully and deliberately. She would always love her late husband's memory. But that chapter of her life was closed. This was a new chapter, and it required courage of a different kind. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said to Ezra, her voice steady and sure. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded with respect. "All right. Here's the plan." The plan Ezra outlined was risky, dependent on timing and luck and a dozen things going right. But as Martha listened, she understood that it came from hard-won experience, from a past Ezra had tried to bury but could never quite escape. "We need to know more about you," Martha said gently after he'd finished explaining. "If we're going to do this, if we're going to trust our lives to your plan, we need to understand what you're capable of." Ezra nodded slowly. "You're right." He sat down at the kitchen table, and the others, Tommy, Jacob, and Lynn, gathered around. "I haven't been entirely honest about who I was before I came to these mountains." He pulled something from his saddlebag, which he'd brought inside earlier. It was a photograph, faded and creased from years of being carried. He laid it on the table. The image showed a much younger man, lean, clean-shaven, wearing a Union cavalry officer's uniform. He stood among a group of other soldiers, but even in the photograph he carried himself differently. There was an intensity in his eyes, a dangerous confidence in his posture. "That's you," Tommy breathed. "But you're an officer," Ezra corrected. "Captain Ezra Cole, 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. I enlisted in 61, made captain by 63, fought at Gettysburg, Spotsylvania, Petersburg. I was a cavalry officer, but I also served as a sharpshooter when needed." Martha studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the young soldier with the weathered mountain man she'd come to know. "What happened after the war?" "Most of my unit mustered out in 65. I stayed on. The Army needed experienced officers for the Indian Wars out west." Ezra's voice was flat, emotionless. "I spent 3 more years in uniform, this time fighting Comanche, Apache, Sioux. Different enemy, same blood." 3 years, Jacob said thoughtfully. "That would have taken you to 68 or so. Right around when you showed up here. 68 exactly. I was stationed at Fort Laramie. We'd been tracking a Sioux band that had attacked a settlement, killed 2 families, took a woman and her daughter captive." Ezra's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "We caught up to them in the Black Hills. There was a fight." He was quiet for a long moment before continuing. "We got the hostages back, both alive. But the cost, we killed 16 men, young warriors, old men who'd come out to protect their families, even a couple of boys no older than Tommy here. I was the one giving orders. I was the one who said to keep firing. But they were the enemy," Tommy said uncertainly. "They'd attacked settlers, were they? Or were they just desperate people trying to survive on land that was being taken from them, same as us?" Ezra shook his head. "I stopped asking those questions after a while. Stopped thinking about whether what I was doing was right or necessary. I just followed orders and did my job. And I was good at it. Too good." Martha reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "What made you stop?" "There was a young warrior, couldn't have been more than 17. He'd been wounded in the initial exchange, but he was still trying to fight, trying to protect an old woman behind him. His grandmother, maybe. I had him in my sights. Clean shot, maybe 40 yards. I could have ended it quick, but I hesitated. Just for a second." Ezra's voice dropped almost to a whisper. He looked at me. Just looked. And I saw, I don't know, recognition, maybe. Like he knew he was about to die and he was asking me why. Asking me what gave me the right. "What did you do?" Lynn asked quietly. "I took the shot. I always took the shot. That was my job." Ezra pulled his hand back from Martha's, as if he didn't deserve her comfort. "He died, and so did the old woman he'd been protecting, caught in the crossfire. I went back to Fort Laramie, filed my report, received commendations for a successful rescue operation. And 3 days later, I walked into my commanding officer's tent and resigned my commission, just like that." Tommy asked, "Just like that?" I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't pull that trigger one more time and pretend it meant something, so I left. Took my horse, my rifle, what little money I'd saved, and I rode west until I couldn't go any further. Found these mountains and built a cabin and told myself I'd never hurt another living soul unless I had no choice. Jacob broke the silence that followed. But you were good at it. Fighting, I mean. Leading men, I was. Ezra met the old man's eyes. I was very good at it. And that's what scared me most, how easy it became. How little I felt after a while. Martha's mind was spinning. The gentle man who'd paid her debt, who'd dried dishes in her kitchen and spoken so carefully about what he saw when he looked at her. That man had been a soldier, a killer, someone who'd given orders that ended lives. The two images didn't quite fit together, like puzzle pieces from different sets, but maybe that was the point. Maybe Ezra had come to these mountains, not just to escape his past, but to become someone different. Someone better. Why are you telling us this now? She asked. Because if we're going to do what needs doing, you need to understand what you're asking of me, and what it might cost. Ezra looked around the table at each of them. The man in that photograph, the soldier who gave those orders, he's still in here somewhere. I've tried to bury him, but he's not gone. If I do what I'm planning to do tonight, I'll be letting him out again. And I don't know if I can put him back. What exactly are you planning? Martha asked, though part of her already knew. Calhoun expects us to either flee or surrender by sundown. What he doesn't expect is an assault. He doesn't expect us to bring the fight to him. Ezra pulled out a rough sketch he'd made of the town's main street. His men are spread out. 2 at the saloon, probably 2 more on patrol, the rest with Calhoun himself. They're confident, which makes them sloppy. If we hit them hard and fast, we can cut their numbers before they have time to organize. You're talking about killing them, Lynn said, his voice shaking slightly. I'm talking about defending this town and everyone in it. That's not murder, it's survival. Ezra's eyes were hard. But yes, some of them will die. Maybe all of them, if it comes to that. And maybe you, Martha said. Maybe us, maybe. War doesn't come with guarantees. He looked at her directly. But doing nothing guarantees that Calhoun and his men will take whatever they want, hurt whoever they want, and probably burn this town to the ground when they're finished. I've seen men like him before. They don't stop until someone stops them, Tommy spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. I'll help. I'm not much of a fighter, but I can shoot a rifle well enough. No, Ezra said firmly. You're too young and you're not trained. You'd be more liability than help. Then what am I supposed to do? Hide while you fight for us? You're supposed to protect Martha and the others if something goes wrong. You're supposed to be the last line of defense. Ezra's expression softened slightly. That's not cowardice, son. That's responsibility. And it's just as important as what I'm doing. What about me? Martha asked. I'm not hiding while you put yourself in danger. Martha, don't Martha me. This is my home. These are my people. If you're going to fight for us, then I'm going to fight beside you. Ezra looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Martha's expression stopped him. You ever fire a gun? My husband taught me. I'm not a sharpshooter, but I can hit what I aim at, close range. All right. Ezra pulled out a pistol from his belt. Then you'll cover me from the boarding house windows. You don't take a shot unless you have to. And if things go bad, you get everyone to the church and barricade yourselves in. Understood. Understood. They spent the next hour preparing. Ezra checked his rifle and pistols with practiced efficiency, loading and reloading until his movements were fluid and automatic. Martha gathered ammunition and supplies. Tommy and Lynn reinforced the doors and windows, creating firing positions that would give them some protection if the gang tried to assault the boarding house. Jacob, surprisingly, contributed his own knowledge. I was at Antietam, he said. Saw how soldiers positioned themselves in urban combat. You'll want someone watching the north approach. They might try to flank from that direction. Good thinking, Ezra acknowledged. Can you handle a rifle? Arthritis makes it hard to aim, but I can keep watch and call out positions. As they worked, Martha caught herself glancing at the photograph Ezra had shared. The young officer staring back at her seemed like a stranger, but perhaps that was fitting. People were never just one thing. They were composites of their past and present, their choices and their regrets, the person they'd been and the person they were trying to become. Ezra Cole had been a soldier. He'd killed, given orders that resulted in death, done things he couldn't forgive himself for. But he'd also spent 15 years trying to be something different. He'd chosen solitude over violence, had shown Martha kindness when no one else would, had sacrificed everything he owned to save her home. Which version was the real Ezra? Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe he was still figuring it out. As the sun dropped lower in the sky, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, a different kind of tension settled over the boarding house. This was the calm before the storm, the quiet moment when soldiers checked their weapons one last time and said silent prayers to whatever gods might listen. Ezra stood by the window, watching the saloon. Martha came to stand beside him. "I meant what I said earlier," she told him quietly. "About you mattering to me. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that. Martha, if I don't make it, don't say goodbye like that. We're both going to make it, and tomorrow we're going to have breakfast together, and we're going to figure out what comes next." Ezra smiled, a small, sad expression. "You really believe that?" "I have to, because if I let myself think otherwise, I won't be able to do what needs doing." She took his hand. "Promise me something." "What?" "That you won't lose yourself in this. That soldier in the photograph, he's part of you, but he's not all of you. Don't let him take over completely. I'll try. Promise me." "I promise," Ezra said, and squeezed her hand gently. Then the sun touched the horizon, and the time for talking was over. Across town, in the saloon, Jack Calhoun poured himself another whiskey and smiled. By now, the old woman and her protector would be packing their things, getting ready to abandon the boarding house like the cowards he knew they were. In another hour, he'd have a comfortable place to sleep, plenty of food, and total control over this pathetic little town. Life was good. What Calhoun didn't know, what his confidence and his cruelty had blinded him to, was that sometimes the people you underestimate are the most dangerous. Sometimes the old soldiers you dismiss still remember how to fight. And sometimes the quiet courage of ordinary people can stand against the loudest cruelty. He was about to learn all three lessons at once. The sun had fully set when Sheriff Dalton's badge appeared on Martha's doorstep. Tommy found it when he went to check the street. A simple piece of tin, pinned to a crumpled note. "Can't do this anymore. God forgive me." R.D. Tommy brought it inside, his hands shaking. He ran. The sheriff actually ran. Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach. Sheriff Dalton, for all his uselessness, had been the last symbol of lawful authority in Redemption Springs. With him gone, there was nothing standing between the town and Calhoun's gang except she looked at Ezra, who took the badge from Tommy and turned it over in his hands. "Good," Ezra said quietly. "Good?" Tommy's voice cracked with disbelief. "How is that good?" "Because now we don't have to worry about him getting in the way or trying to negotiate. The lines are clear." Ezra set the badge on the table. "And because it means the town knows there's no one coming to save them. When we move, we'll be the only hope they have." Through the window, Martha could see lights in several houses winking out. Families were barricading themselves in, preparing for whatever the night might bring. The saloon, by contrast, blazed with lamplight. Loud voices and laughter carried across the empty street. "They're celebrating," Lynn said bitterly. "They think they've won." "They have won, for now," Ezra replied. "But that confidence will make them careless, and carelessness kills." He moved to the table where his weapons were laid out. 2 pistols, his rifle, ammunition for each. He'd cleaned and checked them all twice already, but he ran through the process one more time with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Martha watched him and saw the transformation happening. The gentle mountain man who dried dishes in her kitchen was receding, replaced by something harder, colder, the cavalry captain from the faded photograph. It should have frightened her, but instead she found it oddly reassuring. They needed that man tonight. "All right," Ezra said, straightening up. Here's how this works. The gang's got 7 men total, Calhoun and 6 others. Right now, best I can tell, 4 are in the saloon. 2 are doing a patrol circuit around town. 1 is posted outside the bank as a lookout. How do you know all that? Tommy asked. Because I've been watching them for 2 days. Patterns. They're creatures of habit. Ezra pointed to his rough map. The patrol circuit takes about 15 minutes and brings them past here every half hour. They just went by 10 minutes ago, which means we have 20 minutes until they're back. What's the plan? Martha asked. First, we take out the lookout at the bank. Quietly, if possible. That cuts their numbers to 6 and removes their early warning system. Then we force a confrontation at the saloon. On our terms, not theirs. We hit them hard, fast, and give them no time to coordinate. You make it sound simple, Jacob said from his chair by the fireplace. It's not. 100 things can go wrong. But simple plans work better than complicated ones when bullets start flying. Ezra looked at each of them in turn. I need everyone to understand something. Once we start this, there's no going back. People are going to get hurt. Some might die. If anyone wants out, now's the time to say so, and I won't think less of you for it. Nobody spoke. All right then. Ezra checked his pocket watch. We move in 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes stretched out like hours. Martha busied herself making coffee, something to do with her hands, some small domestic act to ground herself before the violence began. Tommy paced nervously. Lynn sat very still, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. Jacob dozed in his chair, or pretended to. And Ezra stood by the window, watching the street with the kind of patient, predatory stillness that came from years of military training. Martha brought him a cup of coffee. He took it with a nod of thanks, but didn't drink. Just held it, using the warmth to keep his hands flexible. Ezra, Martha said quietly, after this is over, if we both make it through, there's something I need to tell you. Tell me now, in case there isn't an after. Martha took a breath. I've spent 12 years being invisible, being overlooked, dismissed, treated like I don't matter. And I'd accepted that. I'd made peace with being the woman nobody sees. She paused. But you saw me, not just when you paid my debt, but before that. You looked at me like I was worth something, like I mattered. And that changed everything. Martha, let me finish. I know we barely know each other. I know this is probably too much, too fast. But life's short, and tonight might be shorter still, so I'm going to say it anyway. She met his eyes. I care about you, Ezra Cole, more than I probably should. And whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that. I want you to have that to hold on to. Ezra set down the coffee cup. For a moment, he just looked at her, really looked, with an intensity that made her breath catch. I came down from that. Mountain weeks ago, planning to pay your debt and disappear back into my solitude, he said finally. I thought that would be enough. That I could do one good thing and then go back to being alone with my guilt and my regrets. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. But then you invited me to dinner, and you touched my hand, and you looked at me like I was still human, still worth saving. And I realized I don't want to be alone anymore. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. So what are you saying? I'm saying that when this is over, and we are both going to make it, because I'm not leaving you to face this world alone, I want to stop hiding. I want to build something. With you, if you'll have me. Yes, Martha said simply. Yes. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, on the precipice of violence, but finding something like peace in each other's presence. Then Ezra's pocket watch chimed softly. Time to move! Tommy Lynn, you know what to do. Bar the doors behind us. Don't open them for anyone but me or Martha, and only after you're sure it's really us. If more than an hour passes with no word, assume the worst and get everyone to the church. But, Tommy started. No arguments. You're the last line of defense. Ezra handed him a pistol. Keep this ready. Fire through the window if anyone tries to force entry. Aim for center mass, chest or stomach. Don't try for headshots. They're too hard to make under stress. Tommy took the gun with reverent fear, as if it might explode in his hands. Ezra turned to Jacob. You're in charge here. I know your body's not what it used to be, but your mind's sharp. Keep everyone calm, keep everyone thinking. You just worry about staying alive out there, son. We'll be fine in here." Martha had changed into darker clothes, practical for moving at night. She tied her hair back and tucked her skirts into her belt to keep them from tangling. The pistol Ezra had given her felt heavy and foreign in her hand, but she'd practiced loading and unloading it until the movements became automatic. "Ready?" Ezra asked her. "No, but let's do it anyway." They slipped out the back door of the boarding house into the narrow alley that ran behind the buildings. The night was cool and clear, with enough moonlight to see by, but not enough to make them obvious targets. Ezra moved with careful silence, and Martha did her best to follow his example, stepping where he stepped, avoiding anything that might make noise. They made their way through the maze of back alleys toward the bank. The lookout was posted on the front steps, clearly visible from the main street, but with his back partly to the alley. Ezra studied him for a moment, calculating. Young, maybe 20, not paying attention, looking at the saloon, probably wishing he was inside drinking with the others. Ezra's voice was barely a whisper. "Stay here. I'm going to circle around behind him." "What are you going to do?" "What needs doing? Keep watch. If anyone comes, whistle softly, like a bird." Before Martha could respond, Ezra melted into the shadows. She lost sight of him almost immediately, which was terrifying. She crouched behind a water barrel, her pistol gripped in both hands, and watched the lookout. The young man shifted his weight from foot to foot, bored. He pulled out a cigarette and struck a match, the brief flare of light painting his face in sharp relief. He was young, painfully young. Probably not much older than Tommy, probably. Joined Calhoun's gang because he needed money or adventure or some misguided sense of belonging. And Ezra was going to kill him. Martha's stomach twisted. She understood the necessity. They couldn't leave the lookout to raise the alarm, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. This was someone's son, someone's brother, someone who'd made bad choices but maybe didn't deserve to die for them. But then she thought about Calhoun's threats against Jacob and Lynn and Tommy. She thought about what men like this gang had done to other towns, other families. She thought about the choice Ezra was making to protect the people he cared about, whatever the cost to himself. Sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. The lookout finished his cigarette and flicked it into the street. He yawned, stretched, and turned slightly. Ezra emerged from the shadows behind him, moving with deadly silence. There was a brief struggle, barely more than a rustle of cloth and a muffled gasp, and then the lookout slumped forward into Ezra's arms. Ezra lowered him carefully to the ground and checked for a pulse. A moment later, Ezra appeared beside Martha, startling her despite his warning. "Is he—" Martha couldn't finish the question. "Unconscious. I choked him out. He'll live, but he'll be out for a while." Ezra wiped sweat from his forehead. "I dragged him into the alley and tied him up. By the time he wakes up, this will be over one way or another." But Martha had celebrated too soon. As the crowd dispersed and people began tending to the wounded and securing the captured gang members, a shout came from the boarding house. "Fire! The boarding house is on fire!" Martha's heart stopped. She spun to see orange flames licking at the rear of her building, spreading rapidly across the dry wooden roof. In the chaos of the fight, no one had noticed one of Calhoun's men, wounded but conscious, crawl to the back of the building and light it ablaze. "Tommy! Lynn Jacob!" Martha screamed and ran toward the building. Ezra caught her arm. "Wait," but Martha tore free and kept running. Those were her people in there, her responsibility. She'd promised to protect them, and she wasn't about to let them burn. The front door was still barred from the inside. Martha pounded on it frantically. "Tommy, open the door!" No response. The smoke must already be thick inside. Ezra arrived beside her, his rifle slung over his back. "Move." He kicked the door once, twice. On the third strike, the bar inside cracked and the door burst inward. Smoke poured out in thick black clouds. Inside, Martha could hear coughing, could see flames spreading across the ceiling from the back of the building toward the front rooms. "Stay here," Ezra ordered. "Like hell I will." They plunged into the smoke together. The heat was intense, the air almost impossible to breathe. Martha pulled her shawl over her mouth and nose, but it barely helped. Her eyes watered immediately, blurring her vision. "Tommy!" she called. "Lynn, Jacob!" A muffled response came from upstairs. Ezra grabbed Martha's hand, and they stumbled toward the staircase. The fire hadn't reached it yet, but smoke filled the upper floor like a suffocating fog. They found Tommy first, collapsed in the hallway outside his room, overcome by smoke. Ezra hoisted the young man over his shoulder with a grunt. Tommy might be young, but he was solid weight. "Get him out," Martha said. "I'll find the others. Martha, go!" "I know this house better than you do." Ezra hesitated only a second, then nodded and carried Tommy toward the stairs. Martha pushed deeper into the smoke, feeling her way along the familiar walls. Lynn's room was at the end of the hall. She found the door closed. Good, that would have kept some of the smoke out, and pushed it open. Lynn was at the window trying to open it, but the old frame had swollen shut. When he saw Martha, relief flooded his face. "Mrs. Hendricks, I couldn't get out." "Come on!" Martha grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the hall. But the smoke was thicker now, disorienting. Martha's sense of direction began to fail. Which way was the stairs? Then Ezra was there again, emerging from the smoke like a ghost. "This way." He guided them through the burning building, one hand on Martha's shoulder, moving with certainty, even though he could barely see. His cavalry training, Martha realized. He'd learned to navigate in chaos, to keep his head when everything was falling apart. They made it to the stairs just as a portion of the ceiling collapsed behind them, showering sparks and burning debris. Lynn cried out, and Martha felt heat sear across her back, but they kept moving, stumbling down the stairs and out into the blessed cool air of the street. Townspeople swarmed around them. Someone threw a blanket over Martha's shoulders. She realized her dress had caught fire in the back. Someone else was pouring water over Lynn's singed hair. Tommy was conscious again, coughing violently but alive. "Jacob," Martha gasped, looking at the burning building. "Where's Jacob?" Tommy's eyes widened in horror. "He was in the parlor. Last I saw, he was keeping watch at the window." Martha didn't wait to hear more. She turned back toward the boarding house, but Ezra caught her. "No, I'll go. You can barely stand. And you've got a burned back and smoke in your lungs." Ezra's face was grim. "I'm going. That's final." He turned and ran back into the inferno. The crowd held its collective breath. Seconds ticked by like hours. The fire had fully engulfed the upper floor now, and flames were spreading through the main level. The entire structure groaned, timbers weakening under the heat. "It's going to collapse," someone said. "He needs to get out of there," said another voice. Martha stood frozen, watching the doorway, willing Ezra to emerge. She just found him, just admitted how she felt, just glimpsed the possibility of a future together. She couldn't lose him now. Not like this. More seconds passed. The boarding house groaned again, louder this time. Part of the front porch roof caved in with a shower of sparks. "Ezra!" Martha screamed. "Ezra, get out!" And then, through the smoke and flames, two figures emerged. Ezra, blackened by soot, supporting Jacob's weight. The old man was barely conscious, his face slack, but he was alive. They'd made it perhaps 10 feet from the building when the entire structure finally gave way. With a roar like thunder, the boarding house collapsed in on itself, sending a geyser of sparks and ash into the night sky. The blast of heat knocked everyone back. Martha felt strong hands grab her and pull her to safety. Samuel the blacksmith and Will Thornton. Through the chaos, she could see Ezra and Jacob on the ground, covered in debris but moving. Townspeople rushed forward. They pulled Ezra and Jacob clear of the burning wreckage, beat out the embers on their clothes, checked them for injuries. The doctor, who'd finished stabilizing Calhoun and his men, came running with his bag. Martha fought through the crowd to reach them. Ezra was sitting up, coughing hard, his face streaked with soot and blood from small cuts. Jacob lay beside him, conscious now and breathing, though each breath sounded labored. "You idiot," Martha said. Kneeling beside Ezra, tears streamed down her face, cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "You absolute idiot. You could have died." "Had to," Ezra said between coughs. "Couldn't leave him. You couldn't leave him, so you nearly left me." Martha was crying openly now, all the fear and relief and love she'd been holding back pouring out. "Don't you dare do that to me again. Don't you dare!" Ezra reached up and touched her face gently. "I'm sorry, but I made a promise. To protect people who matter. That includes Jacob." "It includes you too," Martha said fiercely. "You matter, Ezra Cole, to me, to this town. You don't get to throw your life away. I wasn't throwing it away. I was using it for something that mattered." He smiled weakly. "And there's a difference," the doctor interrupted, gently pushing Martha aside to examine Ezra. "Smoke inhalation, various burns, possible concussion. You're a lucky man, Mr. Cole. Another minute in there and we'd be burying you. How's Jacob?" "Alive thanks to you. He'll need time to recover, but he'll live." The doctor shook his head. "Foolish, going back in like that. Brave, but foolish." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Ezra said. Behind them, the boarding house continued to burn. Martha turned to watch her home, everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed to keep, reduced to ash and rubble. 12 years of her life gone in less than an hour. She should have felt devastated, should have felt like her world was ending. Instead, she felt something unexpected, relief. The boarding house had been all she had left of her old life with Thomas. She'd clung to it, not because it made her happy, but because letting go felt like betraying his memory. But watching it burn, she realized something profound. Thomas would have wanted her to live, not just exist. He would have wanted her to find new happiness, new purpose, new love. And he would have understood that sometimes you have to let the past burn away to make room for the future. "It's just a building," she said quietly. Ezra looked at her surprised. "Martha, I'm so sorry. I know how much that place meant to you. It was just a building," she repeated more firmly this time. "What matters? The people, the connections, the reasons I did this in the first place. All of that's still here. Everything else we can rebuild." Around them, the townspeople were already organizing. Someone mentioned the church had extra rooms where the displaced boarders could stay temporarily. Someone else offered Martha their guest room. Mayor Pritchard was talking about organizing a barn-raising style event to rebuild. "We'll help," Mrs. Keene said, and for the first time there was genuine warmth in her voice. "We should have helped years ago. We'll make it right now." Martha looked at all these faces, people who dismissed her, judged her, overlooked her, and saw genuine remorse and determination. They'd learned something tonight. They'd all learned something. As the fire finally began to die down to smoldering embers, the reality of what had happened started to sink in for everyone. 7 gang members in custody, wounded but alive. No townspeople dead, though several injured. The boarding house destroyed. And somehow, impossibly, hope growing from the ashes. Martha insisted on helping tend to the wounded, despite the doctor's protests about her own injuries. She moved among the townspeople with quiet efficiency, bringing water, helping bandage minor cuts, offering comfort where she could. Ezra sat on the church steps, accepting treatment from the doctor for his burns and cuts. He watched Martha work, and something in his expression made the doctor pause. "You care about her," the doctor observed. "It wasn't a question." "I do." "Good. She deserves someone who sees her worth." The doctor finished wrapping a burn on Ezra's forearm. "For what it's worth, what you did tonight, protecting this town, saving those people, it matters. We won't forget it. I wasn't looking for recognition. I know. That's what makes it matter more." As dawn approached, casting pale light over the exhausted town, a commotion arose near the church. The territorial marshal had finally arrived with a small group of deputies. Drawn by reports of the gang's presence, Marshal Hawkins was a weather-beaten man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much. He surveyed the scene, the captured gang members, the burned building, the armed townspeople, with a mixture of surprise and approval. "Looks like you folks handled things without me," he said. Mayor Pritchard stepped forward. "We did, thanks to Mr. Cole here and Mrs. Hendricks. They stood up when no one else would." The marshal turned his attention to Ezra. "Cole, that name familiar. You served in the cavalry? A long time ago?" "Thought so. I was at Petersburg." Different regiment, but I remember hearing about a Captain Cole who could shoot like he had eyes from God himself. Hawkins extended his hand. Good to meet you properly, sir. And good to see those skills put to use protecting innocents instead of, he paused delicately, instead of what I used them for in the territories, Ezra finished quietly. I'm trying to make up for that. Seem to be doing a fine job. Hawkins looked at the captured gang members. We'll take these men off your hands. They'll stand trial in the territorial capital. Between the witnesses here and their record in other towns, I'd say they'll be guests of the territory for a good long while. As the marshal's deputies began loading the prisoners into a wagon, Calhoun, wounded and shackled, looked at Ezra with something like grudging respect. You're better than I gave you credit for, old man. Could have killed me. Probably should have. Why didn't you? Ezra considered the question. Because I've killed enough men in my life. I don't need to add one more to the list just to prove something. Soft, Calhoun said. But there was no conviction in it. No, just done with being hard. After the prisoners were secured and the marshal had taken statements from the key witnesses, the sun finally rose fully over the mountains. Golden light spread across Redemption Springs, painting everything in warm amber tones. The townspeople, exhausted but unable to sleep, began the work of cleaning up. They salvaged what they could from the boarding house ruins. Not much, but Martha found a few precious items. Her Bible, miraculously unscathed, protected by the metal box she'd kept it in. A few photographs, and still hanging on its chain despite everything, Thomas's wedding ring. She held the ring in her palm, feeling its familiar weight one last time. Then she made a decision. Jacob, she called to the old man, who was resting on a bench outside the church. Could you come here for a moment? Jacob limped over with his cane. What is it, Martha? I want you to have this. She held out the ring. Thomas would have liked you. You remind me of him. Stubborn, kind, unwilling to give up even when you should. Keep it, remember him for me. Martha, I can't, please. I need to let it go. Not forget. I'll never forget him. But let it go. Make room for what comes next. Jacob took the ring with trembling hands. You're sure? I'm sure. After Jacob walked away, Martha felt lighter. The ring had been both comfort and weight, reminder and burden. Giving it away felt like setting down a pack she'd carried too long. Ezra appeared beside her, looking at the ruins of the boarding house. What will you do now? I don't know. Start over, I suppose. Maybe find a small place to rent, take in boarders again if anyone will trust me with their business. Or, Ezra said carefully, you could consider something different. Like what? He took her hand, his grip gentle but firm. Come up the mountain with me. Not to live in my cabin. That place is barely big enough for one person. But I own land up there, about 20 acres. We could build something together. A real house. Maybe take in travelers who need help, run a way station for people passing through the territory. Do good work in a good place. Martha stared at him. You're asking me to leave town? To leave everything I know. I'm asking you to start fresh, together. No more being invisible, no more scraping by. We'd have our own place, make our own rules, live on our own terms. He paused. But only if that's what you want. I'm not trying to rescue you or take care of you like you're helpless. I know you're strong enough to rebuild here on your own. I'm just offering partnership, if you want it. Martha looked around at Redemption Springs. This town had been her home for 12 years, but it had never really accepted her until last night. Could she walk away from it now, just when people were finally seeing her worth? But then she thought about the alternative, staying here, rebuilding in the shadow of everything that had happened. Always being the woman whose house burned down, or the widow who defended the town. There would always be history here. Always wait. Starting fresh in the mountains with Ezra, that was possibility. That was future instead of past. I want it, she said simply. I want to build something with you. Ezra's face transformed with a smile more genuine than any she'd seen from him. You're sure? It won't be easy. Mountain life is hard, especially in winter, I'm sure. Besides, Martha smiled back, I've been dealing with hard for 12 years. At least this time, I won't be doing it alone. They stood together in the morning light, hands clasped, while around them the town slowly came back to life. People noticed them standing there and began to understand what it meant. Whispers spread. Mrs. Keene approached, her expression softer than Martha had ever seen it. "So you're leaving us then?" "I am," Martha said. "But not right away. There's work to be done first, making sure everyone's settled, helping where I can. Maybe a few weeks. We'll miss you. I know we didn't show it properly, but you mattered to this town. You made us better, even when we didn't deserve it. Thank you for saying that." Mayor Pritchard joined them, holding an official-looking document. "Before you go, Mrs. Hendricks, there's something the town council would like to do. We're granting you the deed to the property where your boarding house stood. It's yours, free and clear. No back taxes, no liens. If you ever want to rebuild here, or sell the land, or pass it on, that's your choice." Martha felt tears prick her eyes again. That's incredibly generous. It's the least we can do. And Mr. Colm," Pritchard turned to Ezra, "that offer of the sheriff position stands if you ever change your mind. But in the meantime, the town council also approved a reward, $500, to be split between you and Mrs. Hendricks for protecting Redemption Springs." Ezra started to refuse, but Martha squeezed his hand. "Accept it. We'll need supplies for building that house. And this way, the town gets to feel like they've helped make things right." "Smart woman," Pritchard said with a smile. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. The boarding house site was cleared, the property deed transferred to Martha's name. Tommy found work at the livery stable and announced his intention to stay in Redemption Springs. The town had become home. Lin-Chen received word that his family could finally join him in America, and the town rallied to help him prepare. Old Jacob moved in with his nephew Will, who'd been lonely since his wife passed. All of Martha's displaced boarders found new situations, better situations in some ways. The gang's attack, terrible as it was, had jolted the town into caring for its people properly, and Martha found herself spending more time with Ezra, planning their future. They sketched rough designs for the house they'd build. They talked about how they'd run the way station, what they'd offer to travelers, how they'd make it a place of genuine welcome and rest. They talked about what kind of life they wanted to build together, partnership and respect, friendship and something deeper. Neither of them was young anymore. They'd both lived full lives, made mistakes, carried regrets. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the second chapters of life were meant to be written by people who'd learned from their first ones. On Martha's last night in Redemption Springs, the town held a gathering in her honor. It wasn't formal, just people bringing food to share, sitting together on the church lawn, talking and laughing as the sun set behind the mountains. People shared stories about Martha's kindnesses over the years, meals given when she could barely afford to feed herself, comfort offered in times of grief, steadiness and grace in the face of judgment. "You taught us something," Mrs. Keene said, standing up to address the crowd. "You taught us that how we treat people matters, that kindness isn't weakness, that the folks we overlook might be the ones who end up saving us." She paused, visibly emotional. "You deserved better from us, Martha. We're sorry it took so long to see it." Martha stood, her voice thick with emotion. "I forgive you, all of you, because holding grudges is just carrying weight that serves no purpose. You've shown me in these past weeks who you really are, and that's what I'll remember. Not the hurt, but the healing." As the gathering wound down and people began drifting toward home, Ezra and Martha walked together through the quiet streets one last time. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About leaving?" "No. This town will always be part of me, but it's time to move forward." She looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "What about you? Any regrets about giving up your solitude?" "None. Turns out I was never happy being alone. I just thought I didn't deserve anything better." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Martha Hendricks, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to wake up in the morning, a purpose beyond just surviving. Thank you for that." "You gave me the same thing," Martha said softly. "You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I felt worthless. You loved me." She paused, the word hanging in the air between them. "You do love me, don't you?" "I do," Ezra said without hesitation. "I love you, Martha. Have for months now, probably. Just took me a while to understand what it was. I love you too." And tomorrow we start our new life together." They stood in the street, holding hands like young sweethearts, except they weren't young, and they'd both seen enough of life to know how precious and fragile this moment was. Tomorrow they'd head into the mountains. Tomorrow they'd begin building something new. But tonight they simply stood together under the stars. Two people who'd been broken and overlooked and dismissed, who'd found each other and discovered they could be whole. The church bell rang softly, someone pulling the rope to mark the hour. Its sound carried across the valley, a gentle reminder that time moved forward, whether you were ready or not. Martha thought about the young woman she'd been when she first came to Redemption Springs with Thomas, full of hope and dreams. She thought about the widow she'd become, invisible and struggling. And she thought about the woman she was now, seen, valued, loved, and ready to embrace whatever came next. "It's going to be an adventure," she said. "It is," Ezra agreed. "But we'll face it together." "Together," Martha repeated. And the word felt like a promise, like a prayer, like the beginning of the best chapter yet. They walked back toward the church, where Martha had spent her last night in town, housed in the guest quarters. At the door, Ezra squeezed her hand one more time. "Get some rest. We've got a long ride ahead of us tomorrow. You too." "And Ezra?" "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything. For seeing me. For saving me. For loving me. You saved yourself, Martha. I just had the good sense to pay attention." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was becoming familiar and dear, and walked away into the night. Martha watched him go, then turned and went inside. She couldn't sleep, though. Too much had happened, too many emotions swirling through her. She sat by the window, watching the stars wheel slowly across the sky, and thought about everything that had led to this moment, a debt paid by a stranger. A mounting threat that forced courage from unexpected places. A town learning to see what it had overlooked. A soldier finding redemption. A woman finding her worth. And through it all, the quiet, steady growth of love between two people who'd thought they were done with such things. Life was strange and surprising and sometimes terrifying. But it was also beautiful, especially when you found someone to share it with. As the first grey light of dawn touched the mountains, Martha finally felt sleep pulling at her. She lay down on the narrow bed, her hand resting over her heart where Thomas's ring used to hang. Tomorrow would bring change. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Tomorrow would bring a new beginning in the mountains with a man who saw her as worth loving. But tonight she was simply grateful. Grateful for second chances. Grateful for courage found in unexpected places. Grateful for love that arrived when she'd stopped looking for it. Martha closed her eyes and slept, and her dreams were full of mountain peaks and new houses, and a future bright with possibility. The story that had begun with a desperate debt and a mysterious benefactor was ending with hope and new beginnings. But really it wasn't ending at all. It was just beginning the next chapter, and Martha Hendricks, no longer invisible, no longer alone, was ready for whatever that chapter might hold. 3 months later, Martha stood on the porch of the house she and Ezra had built together, watching the afternoon sun paint the valley below in shades of gold and amber. Behind her she could hear Ezra moving around inside, putting the finishing touches on the furniture he'd been crafting. The house wasn't large, just 4 rooms and a covered porch, but it was solid and well built, with glass windows that caught the light and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the coming winter. They'd positioned it on a gentle slope with a view of the valley, close enough to the main trail that travelers could find it, but far enough from town to feel like their own world. The way station, as they'd begun calling it, had already hosted its first guests, a family heading west who'd needed a place to rest for a few days. Martha had fed them, mended their clothes, and sent them off with provisions for the road. The gratitude in their eyes had reminded her why she'd wanted to do this work in the first place. Not for recognition or profit, but because helping people was what gave her life meaning. Ezra emerged from the house, wiping sawdust from his hands. He'd filled out a bit since they'd moved to the mountains. Martha's cooking and the hard work of building had put muscle back on his frame. He looked healthier, younger somehow, as if shedding the weight of isolation had given him back pieces of himself he'd thought were lost. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "How much has changed? 3 months ago, I thought my life was ending. Now," she gestured to the house, the valley, the life they were building. "Now I feel like it's just beginning. No regrets about leaving town." "None, though I do miss old Jacob's stories and Tommy's enthusiasm," she smiled. "But they visit and we visit them. It's enough." They'd made the trip down to Redemption Springs twice since leaving, and each time the town had welcomed them warmly. The property where Martha's boarding house had stood remained empty, but there was talk of building a school there, something the town had needed for years. Martha had donated the land gladly. "Letter came while you were gathering eggs," Ezra said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. From the territorial marshal, Martha opened it and read quickly. Calhoun and his men were sentenced. 20 years hard labor for Calhoun, varying terms for the others. She folded the letter carefully. "It's over then." "Really over, it is." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching a hawk circle lazily on the thermal currents rising from the valley. "Ezra," Martha said eventually, "do you ever think about who you were before?" "The soldier, the cavalry officer?" "Sometimes, less now than I used to." He considered the question more deeply. "I spent 15 years trying to outrun that man, trying to pretend he never existed. But I've learned something these past few months. You can't outrun your past. You can only integrate it. Take the parts that were good and useful, acknowledge the parts that weren't, and use all of it to become something better. You think you're better now? I think I'm more honest. With myself, with you, with what I'm capable of and what I'm not." He turned to look at her directly. "I can still fight if I need to. That training never goes away. But I don't define myself by it anymore. I'm not Captain Cole of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. I'm just Ezra, a man who's trying to do right by the people he loves." "I like just Ezra," Martha said softly. "I like just Martha too. Though," he pulled something from his other pocket. "I was wondering if maybe Martha might consider a different name." He held out a simple gold band, not fancy or expensive, but clearly crafted with care. Martha recognized it immediately. Ezra had been working on it in secret for weeks, melting down some of his old military medals to make something new. "Is that a ring? I know we're too old for grand romantic gestures, and I know we've only been together a few months, but I also know that at our age, we can't afford to waste time pretending we don't know what we want." He took her hand. "Martha Hendricks, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Martha felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." Ezra slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling like fools. "When?" Martha asked. "Whenever you want. We could ride down to Redemption Springs next week, have the preacher marry us in the church. Make it official. I'd like that. And I'd like the town to be there. They've become, well, not quite family, but something close to it. Family by choice," Ezra said. "Sometimes that's the strongest kind." They spent the rest of the afternoon working together on the way station. Ezra finished the last chair for the main room, while Martha worked in the garden she'd planted, vegetables and herbs, along with a few flowers for beauty. It was peaceful work, satisfying in its simplicity. As evening approached, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Martha leaned against Ezra's shoulder, the ring on her finger catching the fading light. "Tell me something," she said. "When you first came down from the mountains to pay my debt, did you imagine it would lead to this?" "No. I thought I'd pay the money, ride back to my cabin, and that would be the end of it. Maybe feel good about doing one decent thing." Ezra shook his head. "I never imagined you'd invite me to dinner, or that we'd talk the way we did, or that I'd fall in love with you. When did you know that you loved me? The night you stood up to Calhoun, when you refused to let him into the boarding house even though you were terrified. I saw your courage, your refusal to be diminished, and I thought, that's the strongest person I've ever met. And I don't want to live without her." Martha's throat tightened with emotion. I knew I loved you the night we fought the gang together. When you went back into the burning building for Jacob, you could have let him go. He was old. His time was nearly up anyway. But you didn't. You risked everything to save him because it was the right thing to do. That's when I knew I wanted to spend whatever time I have left with you. Whatever time we have left, Ezra corrected gently. We're in this together now. Together, Martha agreed. As darkness fell and stars began to appear, they moved inside. Ezra built a fire in the stone fireplace while Martha prepared a simple dinner. They ate by firelight, talking about plans for the way station, about the wedding, about the future they'd build together. Later, as they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, they'd maintained propriety, even out here in the mountains. Martha paused at her door. Ezra. Yes, thank you. For seeing me when I was invisible. For loving me when I thought I was unlovable. For giving me a second chance at happiness. Thank you for the same. And Martha, you were never unlovable. The world was just too blind to see your worth. I'm grateful every day that I had eyes to see it. Martha smiled and went into her room. She changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the ring on her finger. In a week, she'd be Martha Cole. She'd have a new name, a new life, a new purpose, but she'd still be herself, the woman who'd survived loss and rebuilt her life. The woman who'd faced down criminals to protect people she cared about. The woman who'd learned that being overlooked didn't mean being worthless. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The eviction notice that had seemed like the end of everything. The mysterious payment that had saved her home. The slow revelation that the quiet mountain man saw her as worth saving. The terror of the gang attack and the triumph of standing together. The loss of her boarding house and the gain of something infinitely more valuable. Partnership, love, hope. It had been a long road from that dusty boarding house in Redemption Springs to this solid house in the mountains. But every step had been necessary. Every struggle had taught her something. Every loss had made room for something new to grow. Martha extinguished her lamp and lay down in her bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear Ezra moving in his room, getting ready for sleep. Soon they'd share a room, share a life fully. But even now, just knowing he was nearby brought her comfort and peace. Tomorrow they'd work on the way station again. They'd tend the garden and repair fences and prepare for winter. They'd welcome travelers and offer them food and shelter and kindness. They'd build a life together one day at a time. But tonight, Martha simply rested in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She'd been broken and remade, dismissed and finally seen, lost and now found. And in the morning when the sun rose over the mountains and painted the world in new light, she'd wake up as a woman who understood her own worth, not because someone else had validated her, but because she'd learned to see herself through the eyes of love. In the next room, Ezra lay in his own bed, his hand resting on the photograph he still kept, the young cavalry officer staring out with hard eyes. But that man felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. He'd spent so long trying to escape his past, to bury the violence and guilt and pain. But Martha had shown him a different way. You didn't have to escape your past. You just had to integrate it, learn from it, use it to become someone better. He was still the man who'd fought in the war, still the soldier who'd given orders that ended lives. But he was also the man who'd paid a widow's debt without expecting recognition. The man who'd stood between innocence and evil. The man who'd chosen to save rather than destroy. Both versions were real. Both were him. And somehow Martha loved both. Ezra closed his eyes and let sleep take him. His dreams were peaceful, full of mountain peaks and gardens, and a future built on foundation stones of redemption and love. And high above the sleeping valley, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing the quiet triumph of two souls who'd found each other against all odds. In a world that often measured worth by appearances and possessions, Martha and Ezra had discovered something the world often missed, that true value lies in character, in kindness, in the courage to keep choosing love even when life has given you every reason to close your heart. they'd been invisible to the world. But they'd seen each other, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The story that had begun with a desperate woman and a mysterious benefactor had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. It had become a story about second chances and found family, about courage growing in unexpected places, about love arriving when you've stopped looking for it. Most of all, it had become a story about being seen, truly, fully, completely seen for exactly who you are, and that, more than any grand adventure or dramatic rescue, was the real miracle. The town of Redemption Springs had earned its name that year, offering redemption not just to Ezra and Martha, but to everyone who'd learned to see beyond surface judgments. And in the mountains above the town, in a solid house built by two people who refused to let the world define their worth, a new chapter was beginning. A chapter written by choice rather than circumstance, by hope rather than fear, by love rather than loneliness. And as the first snow of winter began to fall softly on the mountain peaks, Martha Cole, for she'd already begun thinking of herself by that name, knew with absolute certainty that every struggle, every loss, every moment of being overlooked had led her exactly where she needed to be. Home, not a place, but a person. And that was the greatest gift of all.